This is it. This is Iran's weak point, and it has been easy to overlook over the first 2 weeks of the Iran war, with everything that is happening elsewhere, and the seemingly nothing that is happening to it. Indeed, there have been 4 main metrics driving the media discussions of the conflict so far. 1. The literal physical survival of the Iranian government. Mixed marks on that one. 2. The dwindling stockpiles of US armaments in a period of increasing geopolitical competition. Remember, there are rivals elsewhere who are unambiguously more important. Serious question marks there. 3. Iran's own stockpile of ballistic missiles and drones, and whether the United States can effectively eliminate their corresponding launch sites and production facilities. Progress on the US side, but far from out of the woods. And 4. Oil flows coming out of the Gulf states and the corresponding price Americans and the rest of the world pay. That is nothing short of a yikes. But there is a 5th metric that is on par with the rest of those, yet is receiving relatively little attention. Oil flows specifically from Iran. Not the total flow from the Gulf, just Iran's contribution. And that connects to the first individually notable strike since perhaps the first day of the war and the assassination of the Ayatollah. Furthermore, it might lead to the first time that US boots touch the ground in Iran. If that is not something worth discussing, then I do not know what is. So today, let's unpack the strategic situation regarding Iran's key island. Actually, we should rewind for a minute. So far, Iran has tried to have its cake and eat it too. The Islamic Republic is threatening to strike tankers sailing through the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point for 20% of the world's oil. That has caused a spike in oil prices, shocking, leading to both domestic pushback from consumers in the United States and frustration from international partners. However, you may remember me describing this as a bit of a game of mutually assured destruction. Iran also needs the Strait of Hormuz to export its own energy products. Only about 10% of Iranian oil goes around it thanks to a pipeline built with a terminal here, intentionally designed to hedge against the strait issues. But 10% is not much, and we could raise the same issue with the equivalent solution from the United Arab Emirates. The strait closure is a massive problem for everyone. Well, just like nuclear weapons use, there is always someone trying to devise a way to get around the mad problem. Iran's version of this has been to engage in a coordinated dance with Indian tankers to permit them free passage. There is also a movement to allow tankers trading in Chinese yuan, apparently as a way to undercut the petrodollar. If this sounds like it is generally following the outline of the current geopolitical blocs, that is because it is. So far, though, this plan has only achieved mild success. Ships that have approval still need to be worried that local Iranian military personnel are not following along and decide to shoot anyway. That possibility serves as a strong deterrent for self-preserving tanker captains. Resolving this problem is critical for Iran. Petroleum exports account for 30% of government revenue and 15% of the country's entire economy. On the government side, you cannot expect to continue to pay security forces if your receipts are not coming through. Well, not unless you start printing money, which is an awful idea for a separate reason. On the civilian side, losing 15% of your economy overnight will have domino effects on every other sector. The combination of unemployed citizens and security forces not receiving paychecks is a very bad one indeed for a government. This has gone underreported in the media, and you can literally see why now. I can show you visually striking images of US forces in the region, sans any Wii Sports references. There are not equivalently visually striking images of what could be a growing economic crisis inside of Iran. But it is often the boring things that doom countries in wars, not the big booms. Now, there was a bit of a question mark as to whether the United States would put up with Iran trying this. Only a week ago, Israel began bombing Iran's oil infrastructure, which sent oil prices soaring. There was a meltdown in the White House over this, and I can only imagine a very angry phone call to Israel with threats to cut military aid or even abandonment in the middle of a war. Israel therefore stopped pursuing the strategy, at least for now, and oil prices dipped back down. So the theory went. The White House was so concerned about oil prices that it might just let Iran manipulate the system as such. At least some Gulf oil would remain on the market and provide some relief in gas prices. Or at least that might be better than the alternatives to actually solve the problem. To enforce an equivalent shutdown of Iranian tankers, you would have to either shoot them or board them. That is, if you are focused on the tankers themselves. Put a pin in that for a moment. On the political side of things, the oil once in a tanker might belong to, say, a Chinese company. Shooting or otherwise capturing such tankers could then snowball into a deeper problem running across capitals. Speaking for myself, I prefer that this remains a world war rather than specifically World War III. On the military side of things, certainly the United States can detain a tanker or two. We have seen it off the coast of Venezuela, and indeed chasing tankers way far away from Venezuela. But the number of potential targets funneling out of Hormuz is much larger. The United States would need to bring a ton more patrol vessels to the region to engage in equivalent policing action. As powerful as the United States military sometimes appears, it is still subject to the same logistical problems as any other country. And mustering that level of enforcement would be a significant challenge. I have no doubt that it would be easier to just torpedo every tanker leaving, but I suspect that would immediately lead Congress to take action, rather than continue to just go along with it. Also, that is the type of thing that is asking for World War III, which, again, I would prefer to avoid. Still, it would be baffling for the United States to simply permit Iran to sell its oil, as if nothing were happening. After all, the impetus for this war is to take advantage of the latent desire of Iranian citizens to protest against their government. Cutting off oil revenue is one of the best strategies to succeed in that process. Never mind that Trump really wants the strait open. Iran will reopen it when the government calculates that continuing the shutdown is a losing policy. I do not know about you, but having one's cake and eating it too sounds like the exact opposite of a losing policy. In other words, if you want to force Iran to reopen the strait, then you need to make closing the strait as painful as possible. Well, everything that you have heard so far was the prologue for the United States conducting an attack that absolutely no one could see coming. Let's zoom over to Kharg Island, and apologies for my filthy English pronunciation. For a retaliatory attack, Kharg Island was probably the most critical facility in Iran. Kharg Island is of enormous practical and economic significance. Iran's whole livelihood and economy depends on the oil exports from Kharg Island. Kharg Island provides a bargaining lever. The United States could show the Iranians that if they take the world's oil, that the United States can block theirs. That is a very dangerous process, however. How would the Soviets react? Wait, the Soviets? What's going on here? Oh, yeah, that's right. Everyone could see this coming. That last paragraph I just read was various paraphrased comments from a Jimmy Carter-era strategy meeting conducted in response to the hostage crisis. You might better know one of the characters in this play as Mika's father. Point is, this was the obvious response that Iran should have been aware of, and likely was aware of, but still could not do much to stop the United States. Here is the problem for Iran. The country is blessed with an absolutely absurd amount of oil, but almost as some sort of joke, the geopolitics gods spawned us in a seed where Iran does not get deep-water coastlines. I need not tell you that ultra-large crude carriers do in fact live up to their designation, and indeed are ultra-large. They need a lot of depth along the coastline to not run ashore. Kharg Island is the solution. The waters nearby are deep enough for tankers to sidle up next to it. Thus, as long as you can get the oil to the island, standard tankers can take it away from there like they would anywhere else. Iran solves the intermediary step with massive pipelines running from the mainland, under the sea, and out to the island. It is the perfect solution, except it is literally on an island. It might not be the easiest place to resupply, and disabling that one location erases 90% of Iranian oil from the market. To recap, To stop Iranian-affiliated oil tankers, the United States need not touch oil tankers. It need not go up and down the coastline to sprinkle a ton of port infrastructure. It need only to dictate what happens on Kharg Island. Perhaps it is no surprise then that Iraq struck Kharg Island during the Iran-Iraq War. The hope was that it would cause Iran to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, given that it had no oil passing through, which would then entice an intervention from the West. Back to today, the United States has taken a different approach with the island. Remember, any damage to Iran's oil infrastructure will cause both short and long-term harm to oil prices, and that is something that Donald Trump desperately wants to avoid. Strategically speaking, blowing up the infrastructure also counterintuitively increases Iran's bargaining leverage. If Iran cannot export oil as long as the war continues, but can once the war ends, the lost revenue is an opportunity cost. In contrast, if Iran cannot export oil regardless of the status of the war, then it is not a cost of war at all. It is just a fact of life, and therefore it does not influence Iran's decision-making process in negotiations. This is the same logic that explains why some European countries are wary of seizing Russian funds currently frozen inside of Allied banks. As long as it is held hostage, it gives Europe more bargaining leverage over Russia. In any case, it appears that the United States has imposed significant damage along the island's runway and its bunkers that run through the hillside. These are effectively military assets that would facilitate Iran's defense of the island. What the United States did not hit here were the tank facilities further south, or the offshore loading areas, which you can see in better detail in this Shah-era photo. This is very much a Venezuela vibe situation, where now it is Trump who wants to have his cake and eat it too, by trying to be militarily disruptive, but not world trade disruptive. Geez, there is a lot of irony in that statement. In other words, the United States has softened up Kharg Island for a potential invasion, all while trying to keep the oil infrastructure intact. This comes at the same time as reports that the USS Tripoli is headed from the Philippine Sea to the Gulf region, along with its Marine Expeditionary Unit. I want to be careful about the temptation to draw a direct line between the two of them, because one wonders why you would involve an amphibious assault ship when you could just fly in from the west. Regardless, you can see how the United States might be setting up an invasion here. You land forces on the ground, gut the island of anything that is proximately needed to load the tankers, and then get out. You simultaneously are very careful to not damage anything that would take serious time to replace, lest you create all of those aforementioned problems. You probably do not want to stay there forever, because the island also has 8,000 residents, and the United States has had its fill of counterinsurgency campaigns for the next couple of generations. Never mind that the US Navy has not taken control of the Persian Gulf, so you could expect some issues coming in via the water. However, precisely because it is an island, you might be able to get away with the operation without having to worry about reinforcements, so long as you are in and out. Then, to keep it shut down for the duration of the Strait problems, you can always threaten to come back afterward, knowing that Iran will struggle to resupply it with its military infrastructure already in disrepair. Now, I need to wrap up here today with some important strategic warnings. Battlefield logic works along a game tree that is often apparent to everyone. This is one such case. Both Tehran and Washington understand the value of the island and the strategic opportunity that the United States has opened up for itself. Rather than go down a road that will hurt both of them, Iran ought to internalize the problem associated with trying to sneak its own oil through the strait, and thus put a pause on Kharg Island fillings. That, in turn, leaves the United States with no reason to continue to the next step. That is why the title of this video is The Iranian Weak Point That the United States is Most Likely to Invade, rather than The United States is Likely to Invade This Weak Point. Those statements are not equivalent. However, everyone could also anticipate that the United States had the ability to soften up the island, but that did not induce them to negotiate a way to avoid it. And however times two, shutting down the Strait of Hormuz is mutually harmful, yet here we are anyway. Bargaining has already broken down, and it is unclear how much further it will go. But I will probably be back here tomorrow to tell you about it. At least you can get some clarity on this war by browsing through my playlist on the conflict in the Middle East. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.